Okay, let's continue with the skull, and I think one thing that I need to cover that I haven't covered on the first page, and I think I've covered most everything, but the one thing I don't remember if I covered or not is the lambdoid suture. Notice it is part of the occipital bone. Now, so the other sutures that we have talked about, we talked about the sagittal suture joining both parietal bones. We talked about the coronal suture where the frontal bone and the parietal bones come together. So let's look real quick at the lambdoid suture, basically where the occipital bone comes together with the parietal bones. So here we see the occipital bone, here we see the parietal bone, and here we see the suture line area where the occipital is fitting up against the parietal. And of course here we see our squamous suture where basically the temporal bone and the parietal bone can come together, and here's the coronal suture where the parietal bone and the frontal bone are coming together. And before we totally leave this first page, keep in mind that we do have the superior and middle nasal concha, or conchae if we're talking plural, which are called turbinates, and they actually have a function. They actually help make the air running in the nasal passages twirl through these spaces, and that does two really important things that will be important when we talk about the respiratory system next semester. That means they will help moisten and warm the air going through the nose so it doesn't damage the lungs. So these bones even have a respiratory function. The shape of these parts help the body do things that make it easier to take air into the lungs. So anyway, we'll remind you of that when we talk about that next semester. Okay, so we basically went through the major facial bones already, but we didn't really go through the parts of some of the facial bones. So the mandible, one of the bigger facial bones, that big lower jaw bone. Let's talk about some of these parts on that mandible. Okay, here we have a good representation of the mandible. Notice the body of any bone is the major part of the bone, so this region here's the body. This area that kind of is coming up from the body and has these two parts up here and even this angle on it, this area right through here is the ramus. So looking right here, here's the body, this is the ramus. Okay, we have the mandibular angle, basically that point on where the ramus comes off of the body. Then we've got the coronoid process, which is this area right here. So notice this area, this front area. And then we've got the condylar or condyloid process. And of course, this is what's going to basically, with this head portion of it, is what's going to fit into the temporal bone at the mandibular fossa, as we kind of see in that little area right there, even though it's behind the zygomatic arch. We also see the little hole on the chin portion called the mental foramen, and we can see the little hole right here, which would be the mandibular foramen on the inside of the ramus. And then one thing we're going to see where we have teeth is something called alveolar process. Alveoli basically are rounded areas, so we have these kind of rounded areas, below, or in case of the maxilla, above the teeth. But these are the alveolar processes of the mandible. Okay, so we saw the mandibular body, the mandibular ramus, the mandibular condyle versus the coronoid process, the mandibular angle, the mental foramen, the mandibular foramen, and the alveolar margin. Now let's look at the mandibular symphysis real quick. And the mandibular symphysis is basically this area of the mandible where the body here and the body here come together, form that slight protrusion. Of course, some people have more prominent protrusion in the other, but the symphysis is the mandibular symphysis here. Okay, let's look back at the maxilla, or the maxillary bone, either one's correct. And notice that it also has an alveolar margin. So whereas this alveolar margin on the mandible was actually below the teeth, then this alveolar margin on the maxilla will be right above the teeth. So if I look at my maxillary bone, or my maxilla here, notice I've got the right and the left. And of course we always say it from the anatomical right or left, the picture's right or left, the patient's right or left, the model's right or left. Then I see the alveolar margins, those rounded areas in the case of the maxilla above the teeth, where we saw the rounded areas below the teeth in the mandible. So this is our alveolar processes. Okay, something else we have here is we actually have our foramen that's below the orbital that's also on this bone. So infra is below orbital foramen. We already talked about that. If we look at this inferior perspective of the skull, recognizing that here is our maxillary bone with the teeth coming off of it, we can actually see our incisive fossa with the incisive foramen in it, because those are our incisors. So when these two bones are forming, as our bones ossify from cartilage, from hyaline cartilage into bone, then there's this little depression left with a hole often in it. Okay. Now, notice that even though the whole bone is the maxillary bone, the roof of the mouth is a process of that bone. So it is the palatine process, not to be confused with the actual bones that are behind it, those L-shaped bones that are called palatine bones. So the front of the roof of our mouth, again, which has basically the teeth area and the incisive fossa and foramen in it, this is the palatine process, this area. Now, that wouldn't include the front of the maxillary bone, but it does include the palate of the mouth. So if you think palate of the mouth, then you can think of palatine process. So we've already talked about the palatine bone, which we just looked at again, the zygomatic bone, that cheekbone, the lacrimal bone, that little bone in the corner of the orbital, right in front of the ethmoid bone. The nasal bone, and of course in our upper nose region, the vomer, that very sharp bone that kind of runs in the middle of the nasal region and connects to that maxillary perpendicular plate. And of course our inferior nasal, and again this should say concha. I think the word spell got me on that and I didn't realize it. That should say inferior nasal concha, because as we just discovered earlier, we know we have a superior and middle nasal concha. So if we have a superior and middle something, that means we have an inferior. Again, keep in mind the superior and middle nasal concha are on the ethmoid bone, whereas the inferior nasal concha is a separate bone. You have a right one and a left one. They sit kind of on the inside of that maxillary bone in that nasal region. Now, our next things to kind of finish this up, we have bones with holes or space inside of them that are lined with a mucous membrane. We call those sinuses. We often hear people saying, oh, my sinuses are bothering me or whatever. And a lot of times when we are in a certain environment, we can actually trigger these to release a lot of mucus and build up pressure inside of them. And if you understand where these bones are, you can understand where most of the sinus headaches are experienced. So the maxillary bone, being that bone, that facial bone, sometimes you feel pressure in it. And we just looked at the maxillary bone, that big facial bone. The sphenoid bone, if you tend to have pressure behind the eye region, then it could be potentially the sphenoid bone sinuses being filled up. The ethmoid bone and that nasal region that has a lot of spaces. And then, of course, the frontal bone kind of above your eyes. So if you kind of have pain in your forehead, then there's a good chance that you may have those frontal sinuses. So again, looking really quickly at just the way the models portray the sinuses, you can see these areas that are kind of big open spaces going into the bone, not to be confused with the foramen going into the bone. Look at this big area here going into the maxillary bone, this big area here, and this big area here going into the ethmoid bone, and these big areas going into the sphenoid bone. And of course, the other bone that has it is the frontal bone, which we really don't have a good picture, but you can imagine there's space inside of that. The fetal skull has some variations from the adult skull, and the major variations are the fontanelles, which a lot of people call the soft spots in a baby's head. So we know that our bones are actually derived from cartilage, and a process causes that cartilage to go through ossification and become bone. But we know when we're born, we don't have all that ossification completed. So the skull, because it has to pass through the birth canal, it's an advantage for it to still have some of these fontanelles that will allow a little bit of flexibility of the skull. So, and also the ability for it to grow, because so much growth occurs at an early age. So let's look at the fontanelles, the frontal and anterior fontanelle, frontal or anterior, I should say, the mastoid fontanelle, the sphenoidal fontanelle, and the occipital fontanelle. Okay, here you can actually see the frontal bone and the parietal bone, and there's our coronal, there's where our coronal suture is going to form. But notice that frontal bone is even going to come together with the parietal bones, and so this soft spot, which is the last one to actually close up, and you can actually see a baby's pulse through this portion on his head, is the anterior fontanelle. Okay, now another fontanelle we have is where these three or four bones, but especially these three bones are coming together at this region right through here. That's the sphenoidal fontanelle, because remember the greater wing of the sphenoid is in this area. So this fontanelle that closes up right above the greater wing of the sphenoid, right where these are coming together, is called the sphenoidal fontanelle. Now, here's our mastoid process. In a baby, it's much less prominent than it is as we, grow and become adults and everything. But that little hardened area behind the ear, that's your mastoid process. So here where we have the parietal bone, the temporal bone, and the occipital bone all coming together, that area right there where these are coming together is the mastoid fontanelle. And finally, the last fontanelle we want to look at is, here's our lambdoid suture that's going to be forming between our parietal bones and our occipital bones. So that area where the occipital bone is getting ready to join with the parietal bones, that's the occipital fontanelle. Okay, that actually takes care of the skull functions, but I have included another word here that is not a skull bone, but I went ahead and included it on this list. It's the hyoid bone, which is a very unique bone. It's unique in several ways, the major way probably being the fact that it doesn't connect to any other bone. So when you see it on a skeleton representation, you usually see it in the neck region, but in reality, even on the skeleton, it may look like it's connected to the vertebrae. In reality, it's not. It's just they have to put it somewhere. So this is the only bone not connected to another bone, but instead it sits in your larynx region and even has muscles from your tongue running to it. So here we see this hyoid bone. We see the larynx region right here, this cartilage. Here's our trachea coming down. This is called the thyroid cartilage right here. Here's this little thing, it's the epiglottis. We're running right around here with all kinds of different things connected to it, but no bone connected to it. That is the hyoid bone. And again, this is one that sometimes comes into play when they're doing autopsies or some sort of forensics on how was somebody killed. They know that this can be broken in strangulations, and so there's been fairly recent news coverage where that was a case, and they were finding that this was broken, and normally that's a sign of a strangulation when the person was supposed to have hung themselves, and it's normally not broken in a hanging, but there's always freak accidents, so you never know. But anyway, hyoid bone, very unique bone. We'll go ahead and cover it while we're covering the skull.